Reductio ad absurdum, Latin for reduction to absurdity, is a standard form of argument that tests a claim by assuming it is true and deriving a consequence that is contradictory, impossible, false, or otherwise untenable, thereby rejecting the original claim, or forcing its revision. It is not itself a fallacy, it is a core tool in logic, mathematics, and philosophy, though it can be misused or rest on contested judgments of what counts as absurd. The IEP's threefold classification: res shares entry, ad absurdum, strict contradiction, ad falsum, ad impossibile, falsehood, ad ridiculum, ad incommotum, implausibility. Course structure and varieties. The basic pattern is: assume P the target claim or its denial. Derive Q from P, often via accepted background premises. Show that Q is absurd, self-contradictory, known false, or strongly counterintuitive. Conclude that P is false, or needs modification. Philosophers distinguish stricter and looser forms. See the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the topic. Strict ad absurdum leads to a formal contradiction, P and not P. Ad falsum, ad impossibile leads to something independently known to be false or impossible. Ad ridiculum, ad incommotum leads to something merely implausible, anomalous, or ridiculous. Classic examples include Galileo's argument that heavier objects do not fall faster than lighter ones. Assuming they do generates a contradiction when objects are tied together. Euclid's and Archimedes' mathematical proofs, Socratic Elenchus and Plato, and Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka Prasanga arguments against essentialism. In everyday reasoning it appears in shortened form: if that's true, then pigs can fly, or I'm a monkey's uncle. It is closely related to, but distinct from, the slippery slope fallacy. A genuine reductio requires that the absurd outcome follows directly, or via clearly accepted steps, from the premise. A slippery slope inserts intermediate, often probabilistic, or causal, steps that may not hold. The repugnant conclusion is a paradigmatic case. A prominent modern illustration is Derek Parfit's repugnant conclusion in Population Ethics, Reasons and Persons, 1984. Parfit showed that plausible principles, especially total utilitarianism and mere addition, jointly imply, for any possible population of at least 10 billion people, all with a very high quality of life, there must be some much larger imaginable population whose existence, if other things are equal, would be better, even though its members have lives that are barely worth living. This is generated via the mere addition paradox. Adding people with lives worth living does not make things worse. Then equalizing downward can improve the average without making the total worse. Repeating the process yields a vast population of near zero positive welfare that is ranked better than a smaller, flourishing one. Parfit and most subsequent writers treat the conclusion as repugnant, an absurdity that counts heavily against the theories that generate it. The literature, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, Arrhenius, Temkin, and many others explores whether any coherent theory X can avoid it without generating other counterintuitive results. The absurd conclusion, very repugnant conclusion, etc. Some later authors, e.g., Tonsja, or certain totalists argue the conclusion is less repugnant than it first appears, or that the intuition itself is unreliable. This is a clear case of reductio used against a family of views. The theories are rejected, or revised, precisely because they entail something judged unacceptable. Subjectivity and the weight of absurdity. Repugnance. Formal contradiction is objective, judgments of implausibility, moral repugnance, or ridiculousness are not. They depend on shared background beliefs and intuitions. Evaluative standards. What counts as a life barely worth living? How quantity versus quality should be weighed. Psychological and cultural factors, vividness of large number intuitions, status quo bias, etc. Philosophers have long noted that a reductio is only as strong as the shared judgment that the derived consequence is unacceptable. If the interlocutor simply bites the bullet, yes, the huge low welfare population is better, the argument loses force. Parfit himself later reflected that one cannot simply reject a strong argument because its conclusion seems implausible. Some writers, e.g., in recent population ethics work, argue that certain repugnant results are artifacts of restricted formulations, or that the intuition fades under careful reflection or alternative axiologies, lexical thresholds, critical level views, etc. Existentialist discussions of the absurd Camus, Nagel, are a different, but related phenomenon, the felt clash between the human demand for meaning clarity and a silent or indifferent universe. Nagel treats it as an inescapable tension between subjective engagement and the objective viewpoint. Camus treats it as a confrontation to be lived lucidly. These are diagnoses of the human condition rather than dialectical tools, but they illustrate how absurdity can function as a phenomenological or evaluative verdict rather than a formal contradiction. How to use them effectively. Clarify the target claim precisely. Make the derivation transparent and minimal. Avoid extra assumptions that the opponent can reject. Identify exactly which consequence is supposed to be absurd and why. Prefer contradictions or independently established falsehoods over mere ick reactions when possible. In dialogue, the goal is often to force the opponent to choose, revise the original claim, abandon a background premise, or accept the consequence. How to mitigate or push back. When someone deploys a reductio or labels a conclusion repugnant absurd, productive responses include: demand an explanation of the repugnance. Ask, in precisely what respect is this outcome bad or absurd? Is it the low average welfare, the existence of many near-neutral lives, the comparison with the smaller high-quality population, something about justice or desert, or something else? If no clear account is given, the force of the intuition is weakened. An unexplained yuck has less dialectical weight than articulated reason. Challenge the implication. Does the original view really entail the absurdity, or only under additional controversial premises? Bite the bullet, or revise modestly. Accept the consequence and defend it, or modify the view just enough to block the worst cases, e.g., Lexical views that refuse to let quantity of low-quality lives outweigh high-quality ones. Symmetry or reverse reductio show that rival views generate their own absurdities. Parfit's project was partly to map the space of such trade-offs. Question the reliability of the intuition. Large number intuitions, status quo bias, or failure to imagine the scenario vividly can make something seem worse than reflective evaluation supports. Some philosophers argue the repugnant conclusion is less damning once one carefully considers the total amount of positive welfare. Distinguish formal from evaluative absurdity. A formal contradiction is decisive. A mere evaluative repugnance is a reason that can be outweighed or reinterpreted. Different schools of thought often diverge sharply on which conclusions count as satisfactory and which count as repugnant, and this disagreement directly shapes how they evaluate competing views. Total utilitarians, for instance, may treat the repugnant conclusion as a price worth paying for a coherent impersonal calculus that solves the non-identity problem, while average utilitarians or lexical prioritarians regard the same conclusion as decisive grounds for rejection. Person-affecting theorists may find certain large population outcomes tolerable if they benefit existing or identifiable individuals, yet judge other implications, such as indifference to the creation of additional happy lives, as unacceptable, because the force of a reductio or an appeal to repugnance rests on shared evaluative intuitions. What one tradition sees as a damning absurdity another may view as an acceptable, or even required, implication. The apparent strength of the objection is therefore relative to the background commitments of the school applying it, and cannot by itself settle which theory is correct without further argument about whose standards of acceptability should prevail. In practice, disputes over whether a conclusion is repugnant or acceptable frequently turn less on locking any single interlocutor into a definitive verdict and more on an appeal to the surrounding audience. Once the formal implications of a view have been laid out, the remaining disagreement often hinges on which evaluative intuitions feel most compelling to those listening, intuitions that vary with background commitments, prior theoretical allegiances, and the lived sense of what would be intolerable. At that stage, the exchange is no longer primarily about forcing one person to abandon a position, it is about persuading those present who remain open to revision that accepting, or rejecting, the conclusion is more coherent, more humane, or simply more believable given the standards they already share. The force of the charge of repugnance therefore becomes audience relative. Its weight depends on whose moral sensibility is being addressed, and whether that sensibility can be moved to see the outcome as decisive rather than merely counterintuitive. In these exchanges, the audience is not a passive backdrop, but the primary locus of persuasion. Once the logical structure of a view and its contested conclusion have been clarified, the remaining work is rarely to compel a single, already committed interlocutor to reverse course. Instead, it is to shape the shared evaluative atmosphere among those who are listening, and still movable, those whose intuitions have not yet hardened into settled doctrine. The audience supplies the operative standard of what counts as repugnant or acceptable. Their background commitments, moral sensibilities, and openness to revision determine whether the charge of absurdity carries weight. A speaker therefore addresses them by making the contested outcome vivid, by testing whether it coheres with values they already endorse, and by inviting them to decide whether retaining the original view is worth living with that outcome. Success is measured not by whether one opponent publicly concedes, but by whether the surrounding group comes to regard the conclusion as decisive rather than merely uncomfortable. In this sense, the audience functions as both the jury whose standards are being applied and the body whose collective judgment can shift the perceived force of the argument. In short, reductius and appeals to repugnance are powerful because they force consistency and expose hidden costs of a view. Their force is greatest when the absurdity is a genuine contradiction or widely shared, well-articulated evaluative judgment. It is weakest when absurd repugnant functions as an unexplained stopping point. Requesting a clear account of why the conclusion is unacceptable is a standard and effective way to test whether the intuition should carry decisive weight. The philosophical literature on population ethics remains the richest modern case study of exactly these dynamics.